Welcome, everybody. I'm Tracy McIntyre. I'm the Director of Communications here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And I'd like to welcome you to our Saturday afternoon talk for a special Valentine's Day STDs. Excitement, yay! we figured it would be a good topic to put forward for Valentine's. Before I introduce Noah, I want to do a couple of housekeeping items. You might know we're a nonprofit organization, and if you prefer to support us and you want to see more programming like this, I encourage you to become a member. We have membership brochures at the table in the back, and we hope that you will continue to show up at these programs. We love having people come and check out our calendar, our activity calendar on our website for future programs coming up. I'd like to introduce Noah. This is Noah Briggs, and he has been reenacting for almost 35 years, and 20 of those years he has been involved in extensive research into period medical practices. He portrays either a military surgeon or a civilian physician, depending upon his scenario. Today he's chosen military. He has lectured at the Reenactor seminar called Civilian Celebration in 2018 and lectured 2 years in a row at Reenactorfest. He's consulted on and improved museum displays for Prince William County, Virginia. Yay! Yay! He is currently a member of the Third U.S. Infantry Company K and the U.S. Sanitary Commission, the Boston branch. Mr. Briggs holds a bachelor's degree in history and dual minors in archaeology and art. And without further ado, Mr. Briggs, take it away.
Thank you very much, Tracy.
Yay!
And the crowd goes wild. Cue golf applause. Right then. Couple of minor things to get out of the way myself. The first one is we are going to be discussing period treatments, which means don't try any of this at home ever. And that's not necessarily just, here, obviously, but that's for anybody who's actually watching this video and getting devious ideas. The second one is, yes, we will be discussing sexually transmitted diseases. Yes, we will be discussing the male genitalia. No, I'm not going to be hiding behind any euphemisms. So, if you are sensitive to this sort of thing, now's your chance to get up and walk out or turn off the video. All right, we have people here who are very emotionally mature and can handle this. So, all right, as Tracy said, my name is Noah Briggs. Yes, I've been reenacting for about 34 years. No, I am not a physician. No, I am not a pharmacist. No, I'm not a dentist. No, I'm not a veterinarian. Just to keep all that out of the question and answer at the very end. Today we will be discussing sexually transmitted diseases. The reason why I have chosen to wear a military uniform is because this was primarily aimed at the targeted discussion was going to be about STDs in the military. This will have a rather strong union bias to it. I didn't gather as much data about Confederates and STDs, so unfortunately I won't be able to address those questions at the end of the presentation. Now, consulting notes. All right, so STDs unfortunately happen. A lot of them were seen in men. Apparently, nowadays we have find out that 50% of women who have an STD like gonorrhea frequently show up as asymptomatic, meaning they don't show any obvious symptoms right away, which was actually addressed by the original cast by saying it seems to be more prevalent in men than it is in women. So they were right, but for slightly wrong reasons. The STDs did happen. Women and men were regrettably infected. Now, the STDs have been broken down, at least in period, into two, technically three, categories. The first category is syphilis. Category number 2 is gonorrhea. And then the third one, which is kind of in quotation marks, is the canker sores, which actually ties right back into syphilis. And some of the doctors even hypothesized that gonorrhea was merely an offshoot of syphilis. So apparently, things like genital herpes and chlamydia hadn't quite been invented yet. So this is what they had to work with. So on that note, we will start at the beginning of syphilis. Syphilis was usually referred to in its alternative form as the great pox or the pox. This is one of the reasons why smallpox was named smallpox, in order to differentiate it from the great pox, or so on. And there will be a little bit of a discussion of that a little further down the road, probably in the question and answer period. We also have gonorrhea, also known as the clap, which is seen as a milder manifestation of syphilis, thanks to John Hunter, who cheerfully infected himself with gonorrhea, but did not realize that the person also had a case of syphilis. So he got the symptoms of both diseases, and therefore associated it with, one big disease with varying symptoms. Yeah, kind of, and that mistake was carried all the way over into the 20th century until I think the early 1900s, and then eventually penicillin just rendered everything moot in the first place. All right, for syphilis, typical incubation is about 1 to 13 weeks. It was often referred to by the original cast as the great imitator because it can manifest symptoms which point to other diseases. The reason why I don't do PowerPoints is because people fall asleep, because it's boring, an outline, and it's typically numbers, numbers, numbers. So I'm going to give you some brief numbers, and then we'll move on to the fun stuff. An estimated 73,382 white troops reported syphilis during the war. It's broken down into at least 3 stages, usually 4. The primary stage is the canker sores on the genitals. The original cast wrote extensively about these cankers, devoted 1/3 of a 500-page book to them, and discussed them in agonizing detail. Colors, measurements, everything, whether or not they were contagious, etc., etc., etc. You want a cure for insomnia? Read about the canker sores. I guarantee it.
Weird dreams, though.
Canker sores on the genitals, said canker sores are typically painless. They also, the original cast noted that using modern terms, swollen lymph glands, which is not too surprising considering that lymph nodes are part of the whole immune system thing. They also, the ulcers and canker sores usually healed in about a few weeks, which created the false belief that one has actually been cured. Then we move on to the more insidious part, the secondary stage, which appears weeks, months, or even years afterwards, and it creates a spotty, non-itchy rash that goes away after a few weeks. So that's long enough for people not necessarily to make the kind of connection that, oh, I must have syphilis because I now have some more advanced symptoms. It just never really occurred to them. And then, of course, you wander into tertiary, which is usually congenital, which comes years later, and this is where we get a lot of the classic imagery of syphilis in mainstream media. Lingering, painful deterioration of faculties, iritis, dementia, skin problems, large nasty sores, the original cast called gomata, loss of cartilage in the nose, neurological damage, leg pains, loss of balance, insanity, death, sometimes referred to as general paralysis of the insane. So if you ever see that in any books or about insane asylums and how people were recorded as entries, that's probably what was actually going on, even if they may not necessarily have realized it at the time. It also shows up in bones, specifically the triangular saber cross-section of the tibia. Tibia being one of the lower bones. I think it's one we all would call the shin bone, but the syphilis causes it to have a rather triangular, a sharp triangular cross-section, as opposed to the rather rounded version that normal people would have. And the syphilis actually shows up as spots and deterioration in the skeletal system. There are numerous articles written about that are arguing back and forth about whether Europeans brought syphilis to the New World or did they bring it from the New World to Europe. And there's people on both sides of the fence who have been arguing using archaeological studies of Europeans and trying to date certain skeletons to certain events so that they can justify that it came from one group to the other group or vice versa. And I don't think that this has actually been resolved yet. There's still a lot of debate. I'm not going to take one position or another because point is, it was here in the U.S. Troops could and frequently did get infected, mostly by way of prostitutes. That was the typical way that it was spread during the Army. I should note that there was less venereal disease among the Confederates, less likely because they were less likely to grow up near or be stationed in urban areas, and also less money to spend on prostitutes. And that's about the crux of what I know about these STDs in the Confederates.
So being poor does have a benefit. It does. Evidently.
Now, the obvious treatment is prevention, aka abstinence, which unfortunately is not very likely. So there are various ways that you can cut down on it, such as coitus interruptus, condoms, douches, vaginal sponges, apply cauterizing agents to the canker sores if you're really that daring. Sometimes they applied mercurial ointments or even mercurial steam baths.
Oh.
So, you sit in this wonderful sauna all naked, and the steam rises up and takes mercury vapors with it and completely saturates you in it. Now, a lot of people think that the mercurial treatments are absolute idiocy and madness. And on the surface, they are correct. But I did read a little bit about the fact that mercury was, like copper and silver, is also antimicrobial. So giving somebody mercury pills or mercury injections and so on might actually have had a little bit of an effect in treating the particular condition. But it's not really that consistent, and obviously taking mercurials on a regular basis will lead to things like loss of senses in your fingertips. Your skin turns, I think, a slight off blue. Your feces turns green, which was actually considered a good sign because that means that you're excreting the black bile and getting all the toxic stuff out of your body. That was kind of the point. They administered these kinds of medicines to produce drastic reactions in the patients because that indicated the medicines were doing something. And in an age before x-rays and CTs and so on and so forth, making sure that you have medicines that actually do something, both to reassure the doctor and the patient's family that something was actually occurring, seemed to be the most beneficial. And mercury had been used as a treatment for ages and ages, going all the way back. And it's all the way up to the present day, which leads to a colloquial discussion about removing mercurials from the U.S. Army's medical inventory in the 1860s. The Surgeon General said, let's do this because the downsides outweigh the benefits. And it polarized the military surgical community. Some people said, finally, and others said, how could you? Unfortunately, the Surgeon General, Hammond, got himself drummed out of the military on trumped up charges, but everybody knew the real reason was because he had advocated against having mercurials in the Army's medical supplies. So it is a very, very harsh treatment. So there's the joke of, I don't even know how far back this one goes, but a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. I used to say that it was graffiti on the restroom wall in Pompeii, but then I checked and found that, yes, there is restroom graffiti, and there's graffiti all over Pompeii. A lot of it very inappropriate, but that particular phrase does not actually show up. And I don't know exactly what the origins of that particular phrase are, but it's often used as a shorthand for be very careful when you unbutton your trousers. All right, moving on to the next particular disease is called gonorrhea. I think it was gono, meaning mucus, and rhea, meaning running of. Some of them wanted to call it blenorrhea, which was bleno for the mucus discharge, and rhea, meaning that it's constantly running, because one of the primary symptoms of this particular condition is a constant, very smelly drip coming from the urethra. And it's both men and women. And unfortunately with women, that means that it can drip into the vaginal area and cause all kinds of problems there. But our primary focus is on the men because we're discussing the troops as opposed to everybody out there. It was estimated that 109,397 white troops reported gonorrhea symptoms during the war. And I imagine that there's numbers probably higher because a lot of them would not want to report this because they know the treatments that will be coming if they actually do report it. And indeed, I will admit that some surgeons actually use that treatment as kind of a reinforce a moral lesson of, yeah, see, this is what happens when you can't keep it in your pants. Now, there's a little bit of a discussion about why it's called the clap. And so far, there seem to be two, possibly even three theories about this. Theory number one is that one of the alleged old treatments for gonorrhea was to lay the penis either in a book or on a table and either slam that book shut or slam the book on the penis, which is laying on the table, and supposedly that's going to dislodge and squirt the blockage out of the urethra. Judging by people's reactions, I don't know anybody, not even the most diehard masochist, who is willing to actually try something like this. Also, would be a waste of a pretty good book. Especially in the medieval and Renaissance eras, considering that they're being hand-constructed and what have you. The second hypothesis says that it comes from the Old English clappen, which means running, or something to that effect. I didn't look that up. It really didn't seem very plausible. Theory number three is that it is descended from the word clapier, which was originally supposed to be a slang term in French for a brothel. Now, when you actually look it up, it actually means a hutch, which is referring to a rabbit hutch. And because rabbits are well known for reproducing at breathtaking speeds, it was kind of, I can see how the slang term of a brothel being compared to rabbits on a reproducing on a nonstop basis would seem to make the most sense. However, my knowledge of French is only fairly basic. I don't know if it's older French or if it's classical French or if this was modern French that's being harvested and used for an apocryphal explanation. So it's up in the air. Choose whichever one you want. I'm going to go with clapier, and we'll just leave it at that. Yes, it was frequently referred to as the clap in period. Now for the men, symptoms. The incubation period is anywhere from 2 to 14 days after exposure. Involves painful urination, penile discharge of pus and fluids, and mucus gleats. Now, I used to think that gleats were referring to bladder stones, which are little stones that are made up of calcium substances from somebody who is so dehydrated that they don't have enough water, and these stones are able to be made, and they sit in the bladder, and they kind of bounce around, and they irritate the inside, so you're constantly peeing blood as a result. Well, apparently, gleat actually means the mucus blockage itself that can cause this particular problem. And so it's very difficult for the men to pee, and it stinks, and it's overall pretty darn embarrassing. So they have to, if they really want to do something about it, they're going to have to report to the surgeon. And that's where we get into the crux of the treatments. And I brought my visual aids right here. And shameless plug for the museum, this is what a plushy version of a gonorrhea bacteria actually looks like, only without the anime eyes. And it's a whole lot more destructive. Point being, I brought it along because it's adorable, except when it's on the job. All right, so a fellow by the name of Bumstead actually wrote up a rather detailed discussion about treating the gonorrhea. And one of the things that he mentioned is what's called the abortive treatment, meaning that if you catch it early enough, you might be able to do something about it right away without having to resort to more harsh methods. And his method was fairly simple. You take silver nitrate, you dissolve it in something, either distilled water or rose water, and you load it up either into a glass syringe, just like this one, or you load it up into a gutta-percha syringe. Gutta-percha is a hard rubber that's kind of the ancestor to plastic. Now, he preferred gutta-percha because it had a better seal on the inside, as opposed to the glass one, which apparently the seal was not that great and was obviously more difficult to access because it's made of glass. In either case, you load up your solution into the syringe, you take that penis and squeeze open the very tip, and then you slowly and very carefully inject the silver nitrate substance into the urethra. Pinch off the penis at both ends, wait a little bit, and then have the patient try and drain it. And then repeat every couple of hours until the discharge starts running through clean. The fine irony behind this is that the patient was expected to do the subsequent treatments himself, as in load up the syringe and inject himself with this stuff. And I don't know if many soldiers were actually willing to follow through with secondary treatments, because it's silver nitrate, which is a chemical caustic, and it's going to burn. As a matter of fact, there was a special doctor's instrument that allowed you to hold a solid chunk of silver nitrate so that you wouldn't blacken your fingers from it, because it was constantly burning the skin if it came into direct contact with it. Sometimes it's still used in that manner today to cauterize things like ulcers or sores and so on and so forth to keep them from festering any further. So again, he was required to inject himself every few hours, and obviously this is rather painful, and he did prescribe a couple of painkillers involving opiates to help them through the process, but you have to remain awake for this, so you can't necessarily be anesthetized by it, which probably added to the whole shudder factor. Now, for the long haul, if you had a more advanced case of gonorrhea, not only are they going to be doing the injections, but they're also going to be administering a medicine called balsam of Copaiba, or Copaiba, or another spicy little spice thing called a cubeb, which comes from India. It's one of the many endless Indian spices that are available. Either way, both of them are pretty much stimulants and diuretics. Stimulants, they're obviously stimulating the body, and diuretic means that it encourages you to urinate. So taking this on a regular basis during your treatment was kind of part two for the internal remedies as opposed to the external remedies being administered by the syringes. Unfortunately, taking Copaiba, it's very, very, very bitter. So taking it as a liquid wasn't really that practical. So a lot of doctors made it into pills, Copaiba pills, and to cover up that bitterness, they would actually wet the pills after they rolled them and roll them around in confectioner's sugar, basically white powdered sugar. They let it dry, then they spritz them, put on a second layer, and so on and so forth, so that it's actually palatable for you to take it. And that, friends, was the treatment predominantly for gonorrhea up until the penicillin and antibiotic eras kicked in terms of actually treating the original cast. So at this point, 24 to 48 hours, the discharge should get thin, watery, and clear up within 3 to 5 days. It may require also injections of weak zinc acetate, which I think is a more milder version compared to silver nitrate. But I didn't look into that particular treatment in as extensive detail as the other one. Now, for prevention, we can come to the discussion of condoms. I know that the museum actually has an original condom on display along with the instruction sheet for...
Not on display anymore.
It isn't?
It's being taken care of, so to speak, in the collections. We don't have it in a case, but we did have it.
Okay, it's in their collection, not necessarily on display. Anyway, it's made out of, I want to say it's not necessarily rubber, but it was made out of a substance that may have been made out of animal intestine. The condoms were typically animal intestines, clean, cut to length, tied off at one end, very thin, and unfortunately they they were not comfortable to wear, they were not comfortable to use, and there was no real guarantee compared to condoms today that they would actually prevent the transmission of a sexually transmitted disease. So they were not terribly popular until the first rubber condoms, which were produced in 1855. They were reusable. Non-rubber condoms, however, were cheaper. The rubbers only covered the tip of the penis. Full length, one size fits all, not available until later. So I'm suspecting that the one in the collection might actually be post-war.
It might be, because it is full size.
It was often banned under the influence of moral guardians, because it encourages irresponsible sex and abortions. And believe it or not, some feminists actually hated them because the usage allowed men to control when and where sex could occur. All right. Obviously, I can talk about this subject rather rapidly. I'm getting to my conclusions, which is, of course, that sexually transmitted diseases did happen. They were very prevalent and a significant problem in the Army, enough that they were actually writing extensive treatises on how to treat them in the field as well as at the doctor's office, and that those treatments carried all the way through to the 20th century until the development of various antibiotics to actually deal with the conditions as they should be actually dealt with. There were attempts to try and prevent it. Obviously, they were not that successful. Somebody here may actually ask me about Nashville and their licensed prostitution program. Short story is that Nashville was a big staging point for the Federal Army for a lot of its Western campaigns. There were a lot of troops and a lot of women who had shown up as prostitutes because it was a major moneymaker. And so the Army tried several unsuccessful programs to try and get rid of the prostitutes, including sticking them on a steamboat and trying to drop them off at other places upriver. Yeah, it doesn't work out. It works out as well as you might think, as in nobody wanted the prostitutes. The prostitutes wanted off the ship. The customers wanted to get on the ship. And it just wasn't working out very well for a lot of the steamboat operators, who lost an awful lot of money having to shuttle these women whenever and wherever. And when they managed to drop them off, I think in Cleveland, most of them just boomeranged right back to, Nashville, because that's where the money is. So they finally, the Army finally said, all right, well, if we can't stop them from doing their job, at the very least we can try and regulate them. And so they set up some orders that said, basically, that all the prostitutes had to get an STD exam at government expense, and that they would have to have, in order to practice their trade, a license that says that they're licensed by the Army to do this, and two, a certificate that they had to renew, I think, every week or every month, that said that they were VD free. And believe it or not, the prostitutes were actually very happy about this, because their chances of getting an STD just dropped significantly, hopefully. And even if they did get it, at least there were treatments available so that there wouldn't necessarily be, that individual out of business. So ultimately, in the long run, it was kind of a successful program, and I guess it was kind of an unintended pilot program for legalization and regulation of prostitution, but that's a separate subject for another time. But to let those who may not necessarily be in the know, the Nashville had, in fact, actually regulated the prostitution in an effort to keep the STDs under significant control. So, general conclusions are, STDs happened. The original cast tried various ways of attempting to either control it, treat it, or in some instances even try to prevent it. And they met with varying variations of success or failure, depending on your point of view. And on that note, I am going to open the floor for a question and answer, if anybody has anything that they would like to ask. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm thinking of Gettysburg and the soldiers out there fighting. Now, did they get time off to come into Frederick or Gettysburg City? How did it all work there? How did that work?
Well, I'm not quite.
I know, I'm not a strategist for.
Well, I'm just trying to clarify.
How would they be infected, say, if there was prostitution?
Mm-hmm.
Would it have been Frederick? Where did they go? They didn't go to Nashville.
Are you asking how they, in the Eastern Theater?
Yes, Eastern.
The most prominent area that had a lot of prostitution was, what we now know as Washington, D.C., but was known as Washington City. And the area that's now known as Federal Triangle was one of the principal red light districts in D.C., with all kinds of brothels that were under constant surveillance by the Provost Marshal of the Military District of Washington City. Unlike Nashville, it was not necessarily regulated. Also, the madams were paying enormous amounts of money on bribes so that they wouldn't constantly be arrested for keeping a disorderly house, which is the usual euphemism for having a brothel back then. Or if they were in court, then bribing the judges and the lawyers to let them off easy was fairly common back then as well. So it was a little less regulated in the Eastern Front than it was over in the Western Theater, if you will. And that's probably why we have such high numbers of the STDs. Also because soldiers were coming from all over the northern U.S. and from the southern U.S. and congregating in a few places. And that was an invitation to swap all kinds of diseases in addition to VD, especially in 1861. So you have all these 18 to 25-year-olds, or sometimes even 16 to 25-year-olds. Well, hormones are in full swing. This is their first time away from home. So a lot of them are going to experiment with vices that they normally would not do back home. And that's what was causing such high rates of venereal disease, especially at the beginning of the war. Does that answer your question?
Sort of, in my knowledge of the Civil War is very slim.
Okay.
So it's just like if they're out of the fighting,
Mm-hmm.
and then they think that they got something, a disease of some sort, do they get off and go to the doctor on the field?
Where would they seek treatment if they were in the
Where would
field?
they seek treatment?
Where would they seek treatment if they were in the field? Regimental surgeon. Surgeon's call typically took place right after Reveille, so it would be about 15 minutes after Reveille before breakfast call. Actually, they would report it to their first sergeant. They would report their symptoms to the first sergeant, and then when surgeon's call was blown, the first sergeant marches all of the people who need to see the surgeon over to the surgeon's tent. The surgeon and his hospital steward will go right down that list and determine which one of them they're actually going to treat, which one of them they can send back into the ranks, which guys are obviously malingering and using surgeon's call as an excuse to get out of having to be on work details, et cetera, et cetera. And it's all going to be logged into the surgeon's books, as well as in who came, what basic treatment did they need, what their complaint was, diagnosis, what their fate was. Discharged from the Army, transferred to a general hospital, died, deserted, or otherwise had to stay in the hospital for X number of weeks or months while their disease ran its course. And then they would also have a separate book for the prescriptions that they issued to the troops. And they also had a treatment book where the surgeon would actually write up in detail what kind of a treatment he used, so they could account for all the medicines and supplies that he used, in addition to filling out ungodly amounts of forms to requisition new supplies. So there was a lot of paperwork that follows the Army wherever it went, and especially in the medical department. Some things don't change in 160 years. So when the troops are in the field and they've got any kind of a medical problem ranging from a cut, broken leg, or a gunshot wound, they're going to be making a trip to the surgeon in order to get cured.
So,
Now, does that answer your question?
oh,
All right.
oh, yeah. So to sort of flesh out her question there, but I mean, like for example, if they're in the field at Gettysburg, they didn't have to go all the way to D.C. to see a hooker. Were there ones on the field? Were there ones
That's what
in
I
the
was gonna
camp?
ask next, yeah. Are they out there all the time?
Camp followers.
Exactly.
The term camp followers does get a bad name, and I have no doubts that there probably were maybe several prostitutes that followed the armies wherever they went. But I don't think it was as significant or as much of a problem as it was in, say, the European armies, because the Civil War equivalent of the military police was called the Provost Marshal's Office, and their job was to maintain security within the actual army itself. And so only women who were actually authorized to be there and actually had things like passes and licenses to work there and so on and so forth. So example, the company laundress is going to be an independent contractor. She's entitled to draw rations, and she'll also have several letters and or certificates that say that she is a woman of good character and probably will even be one of the soldiers' wives. So she's definitely off limits unless you really want some serious trouble in your life.
They're the first government contract.
Yes, so they were literally in the field government contractors. So it wasn't just, the wife that's supplementing her income, sewing buttons back on shirts and washing laundry and then having horizontal refreshments in the evening. It's less likely to happen. Did it happen? It could have happened. I'm not going to say never, never say always. There are possibilities that it could have happened, but since the Civil War has such extensive and detailed records, it's easy to see whether or not prostitutes were following the army or prostitutes were trying to serve as troops in specific cities, either before or after a battle, et cetera, et cetera. And after Gettysburg was just so devastated by the battle in the first place and so overwhelmed by all the casualties, a lot of people just didn't have the time or the inclination to engage in prostitution because they were too busy doing other things.
I have a question regarding the treatments. How effective were they really? I mean, now, of course, we have antibiotics and it can cure it. Did this just hide the disease? Was it still there, or did it eradicate it?
That's an excellent question. It usually depends on the medicine. Now, silver nitrate, apparently silver will kill gonorrhea on contact. So we know that the silver nitrate had a higher chance of working. Other medicines, per your question, were more designed to mask the symptoms rather than fight the symptoms directly. Hopefully by eradicating a lot of them, that's pretty much how the treatment system actually worked. Throw a whole shotgun blast of different kinds of medicines at the problem, see which one of them stick, and gets rid of the symptoms, and eventually the person will feel better. Not taking into account that most of the time people are going to recover from a disease naturally without any assistance from medicines within about a week or so anyway. So the medicines were credited with it, but they were getting better anyhow.
So you can actually, not that I'm, but you can actually, if you have gonorrhea, you'll get better on your own?
Yes, you can recover from it.
No, that's syphilis.
Syphilis definitely gets into one's brains, and there's a urban legend that people in the 19th century wore sunglasses, or the period equivalent of sunglasses, which were basically spectacles with darkened lenses, because they had syphilis. And that's not entirely true. People wearing the period version of sunglasses, they had, in general, possibly weak eyes, or may have been photosensitive, but it doesn't necessarily mean, automatically assume, oh, they've got the pox. No, not necessarily. What people are thinking of, without realizing it, is that one of the syphilis problems is called syphilitic iritis, which is an inflammation of the iris in your eye, meaning the iris can't open and close in response to the light. It stays put in one spot. So you're walking in the sunlight and it happens to stay put, very open. absolute agony. So it's not surprising that you would want to turn to tinted spectacles to make it easier for you to see out in bright sunlight. And that's where a lot of that misunderstanding actually could come from when you're looking at the pictures of the original cast wearing sunglasses. Is it the Victorian Matrix? Maybe. Unlikely? Likely? Unlikely? Maybe. We don't know. But it's not necessarily immediately indicative of syphilis unless you've got documentation that says this particular person had their photo taken and they were known to have been diagnosed with syphilis.
Now, does syphilis get better on its own too? Or does it always progress to the brain?
It always progresses. It's a progressive degenerative disease that left untreated, it will progress to the aforementioned dementia and death. Yes. Yes.
I think I remember reading or hearing somewhere when smallpox was prevalent, some of the soldiers tried to practice immunity by actually like taking some of the pus or the crust of the pox itself and infecting themselves, but really it turned out to be syphilis because they looked a lot alike. Is that true?
Your question was actually the same one as the gentleman way in back, because he had also read in a book somewhere, and I recently read this, I think, on the museum's blog, discussing this, that some troops attempted to immunize themselves against the pox. Rolling back to the regular Army pre-1860, one of the regulations is that all incoming new recruits must receive a smallpox vaccination if they don't already have one. And that was actually part of the medical questionnaire. Have you ever had the smallpox? Followed by the question, have you ever been vaccinated? And that's what it was referring to specifically. This was the only disease that they knew of at that time that could actually be vaccinated against. The concept of vaccinating against other diseases hadn't quite occurred to the original cast yet.
So they actually vaccinated for smallpox back then, like actual injections?
Well, not necessarily injections. It was creating a small cut with a very, very sharp lancet and then inserting a crusty scab from a cowpox into that, and then the patient experiences a mild blast of smallpox as his immune system adjusts to this new concept, and then eventually he will be considered immune from it. Now, due to lack of consistent information, and according to this article, some of the guys who were allegedly wounded at Shiloh, who were living on the field, or were lying on the field because they were still wounded and hadn't been evacuated, apparently saw some comrades who had what appeared to be some kind of pox some kind of a pox on them. Now, earlier in the lecture, you noticed I said great pox. A lot of these troops may have confused, they hear the pox, and because secondary syphilis can actually have these little raised rashes and blisters on them, they could be mistaken for smallpox. So it's possible that they may have been trying somehow to immunize themselves against what they thought was smallpox, but in reality, they were actually infecting themselves unknowingly with syphilis, aka the pox with a capital P. And that seems to me, that would be my interpretation of what's actually going on. Now, I don't know which book this was actually referenced in, but I believe that the museum's blog actually has an article that discusses this in a little bit more detail. So if you want to check there for further information, that would be my recommendation. Yes.
I read somewhere recently that during the Revolutionary War, George Washington, of course, they were using the smallpox type thing, and I think he was requiring some of his troops to be inoculated that way against smallpox.
That would be my guess, yeah. I don't know about George Washington, but I do know that John Adams had his family vaccinated against smallpox, and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were certainly big supporters of variolation, as it was actually called back then, because you're using actual substance that's actually infected in order to set off the immune system. But I can't really speak for George Washington because I haven't really read that far back. I was mostly focusing on the 19th century here, and not necessarily the American Revolution. That's not really my area of expertise. But yes, Edward Jenner gets the credit for discovering that cowpox scabs can help people become vaccinated or variolated against actual smallpox. But it was actually discovered by an African physician, like at least a century beforehand or something like that. And unfortunately, I forgot the fellow's name, but I'm pretty sure that if you look it up in the history of vaccination, that individual will turn up. I just wanted to make sure that proper credit where proper credit's due. You know, it's not just the Europeans that came up with these brilliant ideas. Does that answer the question?
He's just clarifying.
You had a question in the back?
Yes, please. I'm sorry if I missed this early on. We were a few minutes late. One of the treatments for syphilis was mercury.
Yes.
Can you tell me the reason behind choosing to treat with mercury since it has such awful side effects?
That wanders into discussions of Galen's humoral theory. Galen was a physician that lived, I think, during the back end of the Roman era, early medieval era, and a lot of it was tied in with astrology and 4 elements and so on and so forth. But he broke down the body's main components as 4 humors or fluids. It was blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And as long as these 4 elements were in a reasonable balance, you're healthy. On the other hand, if one of them is out of balance, then you're ill. For example, if you have a chest cold, you're coughing up a lot of phlegm. So they're probably going to administer a medicine of some kind that makes you an expectorant to make you cough up all that excess phlegm, get it out of your body, and then you'll feel a lot better and your humors will be back in balance. Now, mercury's primary function when it was being used, especially orally, was to treat imbalances of black bile. Now, the original cast did understand that it had some toxic effects. So these kinds of treatments were not necessarily administered lightly. They were taken seriously as, okay, well, out of sheer desperation, we'll give the ridiculous a try. Take this pill. Surprisingly, not a single person had ever seen black bile ever being excreted from a person, yet everybody seemed to accept without question that black bile was one of these 4 humors. And when you take in mercury, since it's a heavy metal, your liver usually says, no, we can't handle it. It's going to build up. This is not part of our filtration program. Please get it out of the body as quickly as possible. And so your digestive system will try and get it out of your body as expediently as possible. This is why it was used to treat diarrhea and constipation in the 19th century, because basically it either loosened or solidified your bowels so that you could go to the bathroom, and at the same time you're excreting all the bad humors and imbalanced humors out of your body, just getting it out so that ultimately you would feel better. And because it suppresses the body's ability to manufacture bilirubin, which is, I think, a protein or an enzyme that colors your poop brown. So when you do go to the bathroom after taking mercury, your poop is this spectacular green instead. And people said, good, he's getting rid of the black bile. I'm oversimplifying it. It seems ridiculous, especially in light of modern medicine and what have you, but that was the general thinking of the day of attempting to treat substances or treating diseases with substances which the original cast considered extremely toxic, and this was their last best guess, their best hope of treating really severe diseases with something that they considered to be equally as strong and as powerful. Galen's humoral theory had begun to fade in popularity by the 19th century. It had been replaced by something called inflammation theory. All disease can be traced to inflammation, redness and swelling and so on and so forth. And if you apply counter-inflammation somewhere else to distract the body, you can actually extract that inflammation away from the affected organ. And that's why instead of bleeding people with leeches or with scarificators, they instead turn to things like cupping, putting heated glass cups against your flesh. It raises a blister, you lance the blister, drain all the noxious stuff that has been allegedly pulled out of your body through those blisters, and then you dress the blister scars. So it would not be uncommon, for example, to see somebody, if they had their shirt off, that they had all these little circular scars up and down their back from where they had been blistered for one reason or another. Whoa! Lots of people want to learn today. Yes?
So how many of the famous generals during the Civil War came across these problems? And how were they treated?
Sexually transmitted diseases
Yeah,
in...
I'm sure they...
Well, the most famous person that immediately comes to mind is Daniel Sickles, who was blatant tabloid fodder by 21st century standards. He had a tendency to dally behind his wife's back. He lost his leg at Gettysburg. He recovered it. He put it over his fireplace. Yeah, he was not exactly... He was kind of like a... I guess so, yeah. And that kind of segues back to the original point that he may have had a rather bad case of syphilis affecting him throughout most of his life that's causing him to do some of these erratic things. He wasn't afraid of calling people out on the street and threatening to shoot them because they had badmouthed his wife.
Yeah, he was. So, another question and I'll stop.
No.
So the wives and the girlfriends out there at home manning the fort didn't have anything to say about your guy and what he's doing? Or just it was just a commonplace thing back there pretty much?
Most of the troops were very reluctant to share this side of their military life with their families back home. Some of them would write down things like this in their diaries and their journals, and then later on, after they died, their families would go through and prune those sections from their journals before actually releasing them for publication in the 20th century. So they were attempting to censor or cut back on the amount of information we know about venereal diseases and subsequent vices during the war. But unintentionally, well, that's kind of a separate subject. It doesn't have anything to do with STDs. But the point being that, yes, they did try to cover it up, but the medical records are going to speak for themselves.
Well, what about the wives, I think is what she's saying, like the women they had at home, they didn't have any control over this, that they would be infected like their husbands.
Yes, that could and frequently did happen, that they would also be infected with syphilis or their chances of getting syphilis or gonorrhea from their hubby when he got home are greatly increased, assuming that he was actually dallying behind her back. Yes.
Were there still bloodletting in the Civil War? I guess even though blood was being shed on the battlefield, was that still being used as a treatment, the blood?
Yes, but not necessarily before a surgical procedure.
Okay, but they were still doing it.
Yes, sometimes it needed to be done, or they believed that it needed to be used, but it was not as common during the American Civil War as, say, 20 years earlier, 15, 20 years earlier in Mexico. Somebody's wounded, and the surgeon says, let's bleed them. And it's like, he's already lost quite a bit right here. Why do we need to remove more blood? But bleeding was not as common by the American Civil War. They were realizing that it was counterproductive.
Well, thank you, Noah. That's, I'd like to give you a little gift of appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And just a reminder, if you're interested in getting the clap or the pox, we do have them available in our store downstairs, so please check it out. All right, excellent. Thank you so much.